Recently, I was asked by someone about their upcoming internship or placement and what they need to do to turn it into something longer term. It's always a tough question, to be honest, because it depends on the environment that you're going to be in. Too often I hear about schemes and placements where interns are a disruption, get in the way. In the end, a week can be spent learning the various arrays of strength of tea that people like, rather than about journalism or content. Sometimes, though, the company is really invested in the process, and you can build connections for the future that lead to freelance work or a job. Have the right attitude, show initiative, and make an impression in a good way, and it can be the launch pad for you. And on this podcast, I speak to someone who shows you just how to do that. I'm David Spencer, and welcome to the latest episode of the Media Mentor podcast. Here we talk about media careers and share tips and advice on applying for jobs and advancing your career. On this episode is Bella Jewell, someone I've worked with and mentored. Bella came to me at a time when she was confused about the right path to take and moving from being freelance to a permanent role. Pretty soon after we chatted, she had landed a job and is now working at the BBC World Service. We discuss making that transition, remote internships, making an impression on a placement, and how to work towards finding your niche, your thing. Bella, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. As with all people that I speak to, I go back to some older communication to see where clients were when we first engaged and the questions that were being asked. But also, we ought to say that you and I first worked together as a remote internship that I created at News UK, just as an opportunity. How do you reflect back on that?
Oh, well, it feels like quite a long time ago now, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it was it was only probably about 5 years ago. I have very positive reflections on that because not only was it one of my first breaks into paid work in journalism, which is always a hurdle to get over when you're a student, but it also was a really fascinating glimpse into the world of bulletins and world news, and those are things that I work closely with now. So it was fantastic. And I also remember it being a very kind of serendipitous moment discovering this opportunity because I had just got a place at the University of Salford to do a journalism master's. And the final hurdle was to find 2 weeks of work experience in a newsroom, a broadcast newsroom specifically. And it was kind of the tail end of COVID, and there wasn't a lot going, and not many people were particularly interested in taking on students. And then I remember following the Media Mentor on Twitter and seeing this kind of perfect tweet that said something like, if you're an MA student looking for 2 weeks in an international broadcast newsroom, drop me a line, dot, dot, dot. And I just thought, wow, that's perfect. So I sent you a message, and we had a chat about the output of News UK. And then very kindly, you took me on as a work experience student. And it was made even more possible by the fact it was remote because I was based up north in Manchester.
And the thing is with those opportunities, yeah, serendipitous is a good word. It kind of fitted with exactly what you wanted, but you also have to maximize that in a way. Was there anything, it's very difficult remote, that you were aware of that I need to make an impression, I need to maximize this?
Oh, good question. It was helped by the fact that everyone, I think, was working online at that point and dialing in either from home or from the News UK office. So the kind of office chat and conviviality had translated quite well into an online space at that point, helped by the fact that we were coming out of COVID. And so I would say, yes, it was quite intimidating jumping in and saying hello and trying to make an impression when you're not in person and it feels slightly more higher stakes to kind of unmute yourself on Zoom and say, hello, listen to me. But generally, the team was a very friendly one, and clearly it was set up very well for work experience students. And we were given, a fair amount of responsibility. I think the bulk of the work was kind of collecting clips for bulletins and writing copy into them. And I even remember it being quite an exciting time because, and this is going to demonstrate my complete lack of football knowledge, it was around the Euros. England and Italy were in the final. And what was quite exciting was that the team seemed quite open for pitches if they were a bit unusual. And I remember going out into Manchester, where I was based, and Vox popping the Italians that live there because there's quite a big Italian community there, and basically just making a mini package for broadcast about how Italians in the UK are feeling about this big football final. And it was kind of a real opportunity to experiment with sound and music and make something quite fun and lighthearted for radio. And I think that really fed into my interest in audio editing and was a really great opportunity to get some feedback on basic things like level and what music you can use and all of that. So I would say generally a very positive experience, and people were quite receptive to new people coming in and out fairly regularly.
Well, I think that's a perfect example of a situation where you, to use my word when I said it before, maximize. And you may be you've been sort of reticent to build yourself up in how you did that, but to offer to go out and do that when we didn't have the resources necessarily to have a reporter on the ground to go into Manchester to do that, get some different audio. And I think I remember that going out on Times Radio in the build up. But of course, that's all really good air miles as I go on about the experience. Is why I wanted to create the remote internship for people that were struggling to find places for that kind of experience, to be able to put exactly that kind of thing on a CV. And in a way, that showed your initiative to do those kind of things. And it's a boring word, but really important to me is that people that I'm teaching, training, employing have that kind of initiative. So taking that forward, you did a bit of work on a world podcast that we did, and you were very interested, I think, in that kind of world news space anyway, as you mentioned. But you also then got in touch after that experience, after working for me, you were freelancing. And I think you hit a point where the freelancing might have felt a little bit confusing for you, or, I mean, maybe not frustrating, but you were a bit unsure of what the next step was.
So I think that if you're not living in London, often freelancing can mean trying to find as many small scraps of work as possible and hoping that they'll build up into enough of an income per month that you can kind of keep going with it. Whereas now I work with a lot of freelancers who kind of purely work for one organization pretty much at full-time level. They're just on freelance contracts. Whereas I was finding because I wasn't kind of close to a lot of big outlets, I was having to kind of pull as many scraps together as possible. So I was working occasionally at Five Live in Manchester, Sky News in London. I was working at Euronews every 2 weeks in Lyon, and Deutsche Welle remotely, a bit of Oxford Mail. It was a real kind of collection of things, basically. And income, in total, they didn't really add up into an income that I could move out of my parents' house with, which I think was part of the frustration. But what I would say is it was a really fantastic time on one hand because it was a lot of different types of work and types of offices that I was working in. So, for example, for Deutsche Welle, I was working as a reporter for the podcast Inside Europe, which is an English language podcast that's a little bit like From Our Own Correspondent from the BBC in style, only the packages from the reporters have sound edited in. So that was a really, really fun job because it allowed me to come up with an idea, go out and gather with a microphone. It was, I did my first one and then I used the money from the first one to buy myself a nice microphone so that I could do more of them. But then on the other side of things, I was doing quite a lot of TV in roles that are kind of called output editing, which in those particular organizations meant grabbing kind of content that's already gone out on air on a program and turning it around and writing a cue into it for the next hour, or finding agency pictures of generic things to use as floats or ole or whatever people are used to calling it. So that felt quite dull, to be quite frank, in terms of, it wasn't very creative. but it was also very high pace. So it was that kind of deadly combination of a little bit boring, but also incredibly stressful and a lot of antisocial hours. It was a lot of night shifts. So I think that side of things, which was probably actually my bread and butter in terms of pay, and the bulk of the money I was getting per month was coming from that. But it wasn't the thing that I found interesting. It didn't make me feel particularly good because I didn't think I was the best at it. And I just thought, there are opportunities here to get a staff job doing this. And I was approached to do that. But I just thought, wow, this really isn't what I want to be doing in the future. The only thing that, is getting me through these shifts is the fact that I've got other shifts doing more creative things elsewhere. And if I commit now to a staff job here, I'm going to be unable to do that extra stuff that I really enjoy. But also, on top of all of this, just the need for stability and one team and one set of computer logins rather than 100 that I had to write down in a notebook because, you're changing organizations so often. So that's where I was with freelancing. And I'd kind of hoped it would only be a few months of freelancing before I found a job that A, I liked and B, I could get. But it ended up being a bit longer. I think it was verging on a couple of years in the end. Yeah, it was an interesting and formative time for sure, but I wouldn't say I was at my happiest point during that period.
Well, I think there's a number of things you said that are really important just to reflect on before we look at that next step. But the idea that, I have, I think, 4 or 5 Teams accounts and Outlook emails because I spin a lot of plates. And to describe what you were doing, amazing brands that you were freelancing for. But firstly, just from a logistical point of view, that is quite confusing. It can feel quite messy. But you mentioned something about stability, and not everyone is, made for the world of freelance and that plate spinning for a longer period. I've done it for most of my career and really enjoy it and feel very lucky to do it. But there is a sort of mentality that comes with that really needs to suit the person. You need to be good at your admin and all those kind of things. You need to be a good self manager, but also some people just want to get some consistent learning. Was it something, as well as that stability word and a kind of, consistent money, to put it bluntly, but actually that being around one team and having some consistent learning was also important to you?
Yeah, totally. Because I think often freelancers are seen as people that kind of flit in and out and they'll be there for a couple of months and then move on to something else. And so often there isn't a lot of time put into their training and development. I also think it's hard to kind of integrate into a team when you're the freelance outsider. And that's, I think it's maybe easier if you work regularly just for one place because you are kind of de facto a staff member despite the different contract. But because I was working at so many different places and sometimes I'd do quite a lot of shifts in a month and sometimes I wouldn't. And it just meant that because the teams are changing all the time, I think that often they weren't as receptive to kind of integrating me socially or kind of in a work sense into that group, which I found quite difficult as a people pleaser. Um, you've not proved that you are kind of committed to them, so it's kind of like, why should they commit to you? Which I can understand, and maybe I do that myself with freelancers now until they become more regular, kind of unknowingly. But it's hard, isn't it, when you're trying to kind of both make a work reputation for yourself and trying to kind of somewhat socially integrate with a work group when you're not considered kind of an equal member of that team because you're not there consistently.
I remember joking with people that some years I got invited to 4 or 5 Christmas parties and some years none at all. And it would just depend on whether freelancers were being included in that sweep of invitations. But in a way, I quite liked the flitting in and out. Comes back to the mentality that it doesn't always suit someone to be like that. And that sense of belonging is very, very important. I also think from the other side of it, the operation, the newsroom, the company needs to have the right ethos with freelancers. I've written about it before where in one organization, someone said, well, why should you care? You're a freelancer. And I went, because I care, because I care when I do a shift. And in many places, I probably invested way too much of myself when other freelancers or other people might not have done. In fact, some staff might not have done. But I think that's great as a brand to care and to have that impact. You mentioned when you got in touch, Bella, during this phase, you mentioned the journalism word, which is something that we perceive very negative in the industry. I mean, journalism is sometimes in a newsroom you are churning through news because it's so fast paced sometimes. But you touched on how actually some of that work that might have been more dull in a sense was actually still valuable because of the time pressure and the fact that it gave you that sense of urgency that's in a newsroom, because you might need that in other projects or other type of work, and certainly the type of work you're doing now.
Yeah, that's so true. When I was having to turn around clips for TV very quickly, or find a clip of a politician who's just spoken to go out kind of imminently on air, that it's not the most interesting work, but I have to do that a lot now, and there's a skill to doing it quickly and doing it well, and knowing where to find all of the footage as well. I think that's part of it. It sounds silly, but kind of knowing where in a system or where in kind of an agency feed you can access a speech as it's going on. That's very useful. And also just being able to keep a cool head to very, very tight deadlines, because you can't be late when you're dealing with live TV or radio. It has to go out. So that's something that I'm very familiar with at the moment in my work at the BBC, because the program I work on at the World Service, it goes out live 7 times in a 24-hour period. So it's quick turnarounds. It can be very high intensity, and it only takes one person being a bit flappy or a bit short for the entire team to be put on edge. So it's very important to keep very calm and collected. And I think also I learned that 5 minutes is loads of time. 1 minute is loads of time. You can definitely get stuff done. It's just about being very, very calm and methodical in how you do it.
So true, so important. When you've worked in that kind of environment, time sort of stretches a bit. And I've definitely been sat quite casually outside a radio news studio or something, and someone said, haven't you got the news in 40 seconds? I'm just finishing a script, it's fine. That only comes from experience and being exposed to that. Comes back to the point of those spinning plates. They might not be perfect, but that phase gave you some of those essential skills. In the switch towards then our conversation, I remember early on thinking, easy for me to say now, completely see how you would end up doing something that you're doing now. But when you came to me specifically on the mentoring, it might not have been clear for you. And in fact, the indication was this path that I want to go on, I am really not sure how I'm going to do that. What were some of the things that we sort of talked through that really, gave you some clarity on that?
Yeah, so I think I came to you kind of going, there are 2 or 3 different career options that I would be interested in, and I'm not sure which one of them I want to pursue. So I think I came to you and said, I like world news. I like the idea of investigative journalism, and I like the idea of kind of narrative storytelling podcasting. And they're quite three quite different strands of journalism. I just kind of was struggling to commit to one of them. And I remember you just being quite kind of clear about, well, nothing has to be forever. You can kind of hop around in your career, but it's always a good thing to commit to one for a little bit and see how you enjoy it and build up skills while you're doing that. And so obviously you gave excellent tips on how to tailor a CV to be more interesting for an employer. So I think that's one of the key things we discussed. How can I sell my experience in a way that isn't just kind of a bunch of lists and names of organizations on a CV, but really kind of emphasizes the skills that I learned there. So that was one thing we discussed, how to package myself for employers. But also, I think, yeah, the key takeaway for me was just focus on one of these options for now, see how it pans out, and then reassess when you're doing it, whether you're enjoying it or whether you're looking for a change. And also, I seem to remember you kind of advising me on different ways I can build skills in any of those areas so that I can kind of go on and do them further. So it was a really enlightening conversation. I remember coming away from it feeling much more calm and kind of resolved to what I needed to do next. And I don't think it was that long after that that I got my first staff job in a kind of world news radio station for a magazine.
But I think the idea that it can all seem quite foggy and confusing is so common, whether you're in your 20s, whether you've recently graduated, or whether you've got a bit more experience. A kind of change, a shift, trying to think what is the next step can be, daunting but confusing. And obviously that outside voice, in a sense, helps, just having someone who's neutral. And when I talk about the media mentor, that's one of the things I talk about. I care about my clients, but I don't have any sort of personal investment. Partners, families, people that you work with in some way all have an agenda, and having a clearer kind of bit of messaging can sometimes help to clear that fog, I guess. And like you say, I'd argue that you had the talent and you had the experience and the ability to be able to do this step, but just having someone have that conversation with you obviously proved pretty useful.
Definitely. I also would say that my family and friends, none of them were in this kind of work. So all of my family are teachers basically, which is great. And it's a really interesting career, but they have absolutely no idea how freelancing works. And I think found that whole phase where I was doing that quite bewildering. And even, things like conversations about how tax works. I remember my parents going, well, we don't really know because we've never had, five jobs at once, all on casual contracts. And, I remember them being a bit kind of bewildered as to what I should do next as well. So those conversations only made me feel more lacking in guidance. So it was very useful to have kind of an experienced, calm person who has worked in the industry for a very long time to share some wisdom, but also to kind of understand what it's like and be empathetic to the experience of freelancing or working in this quite cutthroat industry, because it wasn't something that my family had worked in. They work in a very different environment that has its own challenges and positive sides, but it's very different from the media industry.
Again, a really important point, and one that's good to finish on as I reflect on that, because again, the conversations sometimes with people are, I've had people say, I'm not doing it very well, I'm freelancing here, there, and this place, and I just don't feel like I'm being successful. Or even someone saying to me a few years ago, when you're going to get a career, because they saw it as freelancing and didn't think I had a career in that sense. And you just turn that around when you're in media to go, actually, I've got a brand. There are reasons why people will hire Bella Jewell for work. And as you said, how you package yourself then to get a full-time job is putting all of those things into a sort of package and being able to convince people that then they should give you a job. And you did that very well. I mean, it's going to be a familiar theme, Bella, when I conclude these podcast conversations with people. I always say I'm very proud of how you've done, but I genuinely mean it, Bella. I'm very, very proud of the work that you will do day by day, the work you're doing now, but your career as you go forward. I know that you're going to have a fantastic career, and I am genuinely proud of that. And yeah, pleased that I played a small part in helping you on the journey.
Oh, you played a huge part. Honestly, I think I was in such a rut, and I don't know if I would have taken the path that I had if it wasn't for your advice. So I'm very grateful for your intervention in that quite tricky period of career angst.
Well, listen, I'll be keeping an eye on your career, and others should do as well, because you're a star. Bella, thank you so much for talking to me on the podcast.
Thank you.
As ever, there's a lot to unpack from my interview. And here, Bella talked about a lot of very important learning that she's had on her journey so far. But I think that route from freelance into a job can be hard and is really interesting to focus on. Often it's that idea that choosing one path eliminates other options. But as Bella said, one decision in a certain direction doesn't define a career. And as Bella also said, all of her freelance work had value. Even if she didn't love what she was doing, she learnt stuff. All of that made her better in the full-time jobs that she's taken since. That's it for this latest episode of the Media Mentor podcast. If you'd like to find out more about my mentoring, then get in touch via the mediamentor.info. For the latest media jobs, you can visit my website, or you can follow on the WhatsApp channel. Thanks again to Bella for a fantastic interview, and for Mrs. Mentor's hard work on maintaining the website. And also to Josh Sommer, a brilliant sound designer who wrote this music for me. If you love what you hear and are enjoying the podcast, don't forget to follow on your favourite podcast player. And if you have time, write a little review too.